Well, hey guys, thanks for joining us. I want to start out by thanking George Takahashi here for getting this event started and granting me this opportunity to speak to you guys, okay? It's funny, there's a bit of levity talking to you guys knowing that my GPA isn't on the line anymore. So no rubrics for this and just kind of my knowledge sharing with you guys. My name is Jordan McGraw. I'm the lead developer of Rouge Ascent and the sole owner of Nuno Bear Studio, the developer of Rouge Ascent. Over the past 4 years, I've been working on various projects, and one of them being Rouge Ascent. Rouge Ascent is a hand tracking game, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that, some of the technical specs of Rouge Ascent, and a little bit of what that development process looked like. So a bit about me. I graduated in 2016 with my undergraduate, and I continued on to do my master's degree in 2020 and graduated. While I was there, I was a research programmer at the Envision Center here. That room looks kind of familiar, particularly that screen. And my thesis while I was here, I studied the implementation and analysis of co-located virtual reality for scientific data visualization. So that's kind of a mouthful, but pretty much VR is something that I've been passionate about for a long time now, and I find it really rewarding to work with. But this is kind of a superficial look at me. I think if you're going to give a talk, you should know your audience, and a better description of who I am might be the games that I play. A lot of these games I've taken inspiration from. You probably recognize some of these. Some of these games I've wasted a lot of time playing, and some of them, like Hearthstone, for example, I've taken some inspiration from. Good luck figuring out those last two. Duke Nukem and Animal Crossing. So these are games that I've played. What have I made? In the past, I've done a lot of game design with smaller projects. I've done a lot of like 2D games. I've been doing this for kind of as long as I can remember. These three projects, for example, were projects that I completed in my undergraduate or in my game design studies during my graduate school education. But of course, this is just a sample of some of the projects that I've done. As far as the timeline, I have been publishing games since 2015. That started out with Vintage Year being a kind of a twin-stick roguelike shooter that I made, with the goal for that being just to create something to monetize and publish myself. 5 years later, I created Coffin Rot Brewing Co. If you're in this room, you can see the poster back there. That was a project that I started really getting familiar with virtual reality, and I met a friend here at the Envision Center, and he was doing spectacular illustration, spectacular 3D art. So I said, if you're interested, let's put a game together. Let's just do 2 weeks or something. 2 weeks turned into 2 months, turned into 2 years of development. But we did bring the project and release that on Steam, and that was a really big moment for us. And 2020, I graduated from graduate school, and I went off to do my own things. During that time, I started working on Rouge Ascent, kind of just as an experimental project. I was experimenting with hand tracking. I saw that Meta had released their hand tracking SDK, and that they had implemented this functionality in their headsets just seemingly overnight. So I took a look at it, and I looked at the store page. I looked at what was out there, and there was like 3 games. I was like, okay, maybe I could make something. You know, it couldn't be too hard. So I started development on Rouge Ascent. In that time, I started a Kickstarter campaign. We funded that. We released an alpha of Rouge Ascent on SideQuest, which was a very good avenue because getting onto SideQuest has a lot lower barrier to entry than if you want to release on the store or if you want to do like App Lab. And then 2023, Rouge Ascent launched on May 4th. I want to make sure I talk about some of the technology that I used. Rouge Ascent, the kind of tagline here is "Save the world with finger guns." Um, Rouge Ascent is a VR roguelike shooter specially developed for MetaQuest hand tracking technology. I specifically built this game to specifically target the MetaQuest headsets. So, with the limitations there and everything that Meta had brought to the table with hand tracking, I wanted to make something with that. Specifically, it was made in Unity 3D. A lot of developers in this room are quite familiar with Unity. I used the Oculus SDK that provided the hands API that I was able to leverage. When I first started doing this, it was hands 1.0, which was good and impressive, but it wasn't phenomenal. So later on, Meta came out with Hands 2.0, and that was just a software update to your headset, and it just made things better. So that was really nice as a developer to have your headset just overnight improve its functionality. I use Google Firebase API. Rouge Ascent has a leaderboard system, and this was kind of the first time that I'd really done leaderboard systems, and I wanted to use something that was kind of lightweight and familiar. And if you've seen Rouge Ascent's haptic integration, I use bHaptics for that. There's haptic vests. If you've ever used these, they're a lot of fun. Head, arms, and even more recently, haptic gloves. A lot of the designs that I'm going to talk about today are going to be in the lens of human factors. Human factors is the field of cognitive science that examines human abilities, limitations, behaviors, and processes in order to inform human-centered designs. So this is the field of psychology this is where the rubber hits the road between psychology and engineering. It's what gives you the concepts of affordances, horopters, gestalt theory, ergonomics, instrumentation, and Fitts law, if you're familiar with any of these. I want to talk about a quote that Meta has on some of their hand tracking best practices website. This is a really good resource that even if you're not doing hand tracking stuff, it's just interesting to see about how you think about novel technologies and how you should use it. So they say it's important to make sure that the user can remain in a neutral body position. Ideally, users should be able to interact with the systems while keeping the arms close to the body and the elbows in line with the hip. This allows for a more comfortable ergonomic experience while keeping the hand in an ideal position for tracking sensors. So you have to remember that on one hand, you're balancing the ergonomics of your device, and then also you have the device's capabilities. The device can't see behind you, so you're trying to make sure that you bring everything in line together. That top image is in reference to that text, and then down below, the concept of a horopter I think is really interesting because you don't hear that word a lot in common parlance. Horopters are this is your horopter of reach. So you can see that diagram. This is also from from Meta's resource, and they don't describe it as such, but this is what they're showing. We as humans have a reach that is comfortable for us. Something that's too far. You've certainly driven in a car where you've been too far back and you've had to lean forward and adjust your seats and everything. And so this same concept applies for visual horopters as well. So a lifeguard sitting up on their tower has a visual horopter. And so you want to design systems cognizant of these abilities and limitations. One of the most important things I think to stress is that hands are not controllers. It's important to know your technology. The Meta resource for hand design principles states it's very tempting to simply adapt existing interactions from input devices like touch controllers and apply them to hand tracking. But that process will limit you to already charted territory and may lead to interactions that would feel better with controllers while missing out on the benefits of hand tracking. Instead, focus on the unique strengths of hands as an input and be aware of the specific limitations of the current technology to find new hands-native interactions. So when you're thinking about VR design, doing VR controllers for one is an interesting paradigm to consider. hands are not controllers. So you have to reimagine how do you use your hands as an input system. Hand tracking as an input. So the goal here is to exalt the strengths of hand tracking and be aware of the limitations of the technology. So some of these strengths, I would say, highly familiar. You know, we all have our hands and we use them every day. So if I tell you a certain gesture, you know how to make that. You know, it's very, very familiar to us. You've probably handed a controller to someone and you say, press, you know, the X button, and they have to look down and study their controller. You know, it's like those input systems can be learned, but they're not natural. There's a certain amount of novelty to it. I admit that that was certainly what interested me. You know, it was like I've never used a game that fully implemented hand tracking to its best ability. But limitations are inevitable. So there is a stigma, I would say, regarding hand tracking. And it's something to overcome and be aware of. You know, when people see hand tracking, they might have played some kind of demo experience, and they might have used or seen other people use it. And there's a little bit of stigma to get over. People aren't super familiar with it, and they don't really know what it means. And in my designs, I've certainly tried my best to make sure that people can overcome that stigma. Adoption is another part of that, where, of course, controllers are much more prevalent with VR technology. It's a lot easier to develop a technology using controllers. Same thing with keyboards when you're working with PC devices or mobile. A lot of things have already been charted out. So it's pretty easy to say, you know what your input scheme is going to be like. You know, people have an expectation going into this. That affects adoption of technology, and that's a wider issue even just by itself. We talked about earlier, you know, the headset has a certain level of tracking confidence. When Hands 1.0 came out, that level of tracking confidence was pretty good, but this refers to if you're moving your hands too quickly, that's going to be low tracking confidence. Dim lighting will result in low tracking confidence. And you know, if you put your hands completely out of its field of view, it has no tracking confidence. So, you know, in a lot of VR games, you know, you can do really wild gestures with the controllers because the controllers are being tracked. Whereas with a hand tracking headset, you have to be cognizant of where your hands are spatially. And as a result, you have to be willing to design for that so that you kind of afford that interaction within your design. One of the things that I kind of miss about controller input is just haptics. Haptics is a very fun thing to add in. Like if you're playing you know, on Xbox, you'll feel the controller rumble, you know, when you get shot or, you know, you hit a wall or something. And that adds a lot of immersion to a game. And that's a really fun thing as a developer to implement. I'd been doing a lot of PC development before this, and then once you actually get to throw in haptics, you know, it really bumps it up a level. And it's a lot of fun to design for. You don't get that with hand tracking, except for kind of what I would consider to be natural haptics, which would be, you know, your hands making contact with each other. That's one of the reasons why you'll see the most common interaction method is pinching, because this gives you a good indication you get that internal natural haptics. I've received a lot of very well-intentioned suggestions, bringing the game to conferences and showing this to people. I think one of the most common suggestions people would have is they say, so why don't you squeeze the trigger of the guns? Why don't you squeeze the trigger? And I always tell them, I say, okay, do this, just do this for half an hour. And once your hand starts to get exhausted, tell me you're having fun. You know, and so it's just, you need to be able to make sure that any gestures you're using can be repeated and not induce fatigue, even without anything in your hand. In fact, it's even worse when there's nothing in your hand, because then you're just contracting your muscles. If you at least had a controller in your hand, you have a little bit of resistance, and that kind of equalizes things. Similar to this, players should be able to relax their hands without consequence. So you don't want to have a gesture or some sort of input scheme which constantly constantly requires that the player is, squeezing their hand or something. You want to be able to, you want to let your player relax their hands, every once in a while. In Rouge Ascent, for example, when you do the gun gesture, so this equips a weapon and brings your weapon out. After you've done that, you can relax your hand and it won't do anything. If you do a full palm out gesture, it'll put your gun away. But when you've done this, that's all you need to do. You really don't need to maintain that shape, so you can relax your hand and there's no consequence to that. This was something that I kind of came to realize as I was developing. Don't make the player hold their hand out in positions like this. Even though you're not carrying anything, just the weight of gravity, you don't want to be doing this for an hour. It's just exhausting to hold your arms out like this. So any gestures, in Rouge Ascent, you do a 2 fists, brings up like a power shield. And so you can do this gesture just very naturally. Your elbows can be down and your arms can be up, and it all lets you, there's no need to have your arms out like this. Just kind of something that I had made some, you could say, ergonomic mistakes when I was first developing and realized how exhausting that could be. I feel that gesture states are more reliable than gesture combos. What I mean by this is that instead of having one gesture that has to follow another gesture in order to initiate some input, just having so for example, the gun gesture, the finger gun gesture in Rouge Ascent, you don't have to do anything before that to make that happen. And again, there's no additional gestures after that. Once you're in this gesture, you're good. There's no such doing one gesture followed by another gesture. The closest thing you get to that is like a holographic watch in which you use kind of 2 gestures. So you're doing a fist with one hand and then you're doing pinching with the other. But there's no sequencing to this. The reason being is that if you were in combat, for example, in a game, and you're really moving around, if your headset missed one of your gestures, it's really hard to communicate to the player that they've missed that gesture. And if they start doing the next gesture in the sequence, it just becomes really difficult. And it's better to always know that you can always get anywhere by just doing a single gesture. So I always try to avoid gesture sequences. Similar to that, you want to avoid overlapping gestures. This is something that you don't exactly get with PC or controller designs because it's very discrete operations. One of the instances of this was that when you do a fist with your left hand, you bring out this holographic watch. I realized that if you were doing this, you could accidentally move yourself in the game world. You would trigger your movement in the world. So I had to make sure that I blocked off movement was no longer compatible while you had this wristwatch up, and that was kind of a design that I had to make sure that that it was worth the trade-off. So if you can't move while this holographic display is up, that design choice has to be worth the trade-off. I was talking about movement in Rouge Ascent. So the way that you move in Rouge Ascent, you'll see these little circles on the ground, and all of them are equidistant. They're 5 meters spaced away from each other, and that design was intentional for a few reasons. One is that you have 90 degrees between each of these movement spots, so you always know you kind of have a cardinal direction system. When you move your hand out over one of them, it will activate it until it hits a threshold, and then it'll dash you over to that location. This allows you to move in discrete places. The game world was set up so that everything worked in this grid format. That's very much in keeping with traditional roguelike designs, very grid-based. So because movement is one of the most important gestures and one of the most frequent, it had to be a very simple design. So this is something where you just simply reach a palm out over top of a node, and it will take you there. Nothing more complex than that. Gestures which you do more infrequently, I think you can get away with making them a little bit more complex or involved, but I would say generally as the frequency of a gesture increases, its simplicity should follow in suit. If you wanted to do gesture recognition by yourself, a little cheeky here, but dot product will get you most of the way. The dot product, if you're not familiar, gives you effectively the alignment between two vectors. So if you wanted to do gesture recognition, you can take the joints of the finger that would be given to you by the SDK that you're using and calculate the curl or elongation of a specific finger by taking all the joints and taking their direction towards the next following joint, calculating out the dot product. And a finger that's fully elongated would get you a value of 1. And anything that's something like this would be like a 0. Down would be -1. So you get this range between 0 and -1. You can use that value to determine, so you can set a threshold for, how far does a finger need to be raised in order to be considered up. So if we're counting fingers, that lets you give a threshold value for all of that. You combine that, you have, once you can do one finger, do that for all 5 fingers, do that for your other hand, and suddenly now you can create higher order gestures. So if you wanted to do like a fist, we might check that all the fingers are down, and we might do a heuristic check to see if the tips of the fingers are a certain distance from the center of the palm. We also have the vectors that point out of the palm, so now we can do dot product to determine if it's facing towards your face or if it's away. So you could mask out certain gestures. So for example, this movement gesture doesn't work if your hand is facing away, because if you want to, that limits it to more what that type of interaction you would expect from a player. I decided that up in terms of like the mathematical up that I was going to use was always going to be the player's head. I thought about this as I was using some gestures would calculate, if your hands are up, what does up mean? We don't exactly have a very good, barometer for what directly up is, but for your head, you kind of do know that. So a gesture like this might be checking if your hands are up, but you want it to work if your hands are like this. So, because you don't want these invisible guidelines that are saying, well, your hands, you can't see these thresholds that you've set, and you want these thresholds to be fairly relaxed and lenient, but without, inadvertently causing certain inputs. That's always a concern when you're having these, motion or gesture-based systems, is that if you can't physically see what that threshold is, you can bounce on that threshold and have no clue why it's on and off and on and off. So making sure that you use spatial vectors that make sense from a human factors perspective. So in Rouge Ascent's design, I tried to employ specific design philosophies that I've been implementing in projects prior to this. One of the most important ones was immediate onboarding. If you played the game, the first thing it does is it throws you into the tutorial, whether you like it or not. This is because it's a new input system, and for the most part, you can skip tutorials in games. This is something where if someone's like, oh, I got it, it's like, maybe you don't. You really do need to learn how to use this specific input system in the way that the game is designed to be used. So specifically, bring them into a tutorial and show them how each of these gestures are used, give them an opportunity to just try it. Most of the learning is actually going to be done after the tutorial, but you at least want to kind of check that box so that they understand what's being used. The game uses a pretty comprehensive knowledge base. This is like an encyclopedia in-game that just goes over all of the game's concepts. I had never really done this before in a game, but I did have a lot of people in the games community ask a lot of questions. And, there's an online wiki for the game, and knowledge exists elsewhere. You could ask questions, but really the best thing to do, I felt, was just to have that as a resource in-game. There's no reason to hide this information from the player. Exposition. In the course of gameplay, the players may not be playing what you would consider optimally. So they might not be utilizing certain abilities, their shielding, for example. This is a form of kind of extended onboarding tutorialization where the non-player characters that you interact with in the game will call you as you're moving between levels, and if they detect that you've not been using your shield so much, that you've been taking a bunch of damage, they'll actually drop little hints to say like, oh, you took a lot of damage back there. Have you considered using your power shield? Your character says, oh, what's the power shield? Oh, raise your hand. So it's just like simple things to remind the player that these features exist, because sometimes it is hard to remember all the features in a game and how you're supposed to be playing optimally. As a developer, I've designed the system so it's easy for me to say, oh, this of course it's obvious, but it's like you want to make sure that the player is being subtly reminded, also without insulting their intelligence, because that's not fun. Feedback and informative redundancy, I'll call this. In Rouge Ascent, like I mentioned, you don't get haptics. Haptics is a form of feedback that's very useful. In traditional flat screen UI, you also have the ability to show a lot of information on the screen. Can't really do that in VR. You really want to minimize how much information is displayed in your headset. So you want to keep it to what is minimally necessary. As a result, for example, in Rouge Ascent, when you're firing a gun and it runs out of ammo, it does a ton of things. It has a little text float that pops up that says, out of ammo. It makes a noise, a little M1 Garand ping. So you hear this ding, is a very iconic sound. It makes no sense in the game universe, but in terms of being something that gamers would recognize, the M1 Garand's out of ammo ping is very recognizable. At the same time, your gun outline turns red, and it has a scrolling effect on it. So all these things are important, because without that haptic feedback, I've seen players, before I implemented all this stuff, that would be firing at an enemy and suddenly their gun's out of ammo. And well, you don't know that because you're just doing this and you don't know when you've run out of ammo. If you're in, a lot of things are going on at once. You can't expect the player to always be cognizant of every system in the game. So it seems silly to be like, well, how do they not, not realize they were out of ammo? It's like, you lose a lot of those context clues. So it's important in this design to have overlapping sensory cues. You really want to go above and beyond with that. For several years during high school, I worked at a daycare, and I can remember kids would come up bawling their eyes out, and their face would be flush red, and you'd say, what's wrong? And they'd point over to the corner of another kid crying, and they'd say, he's playing with it wrong. And you'd kind of just roll your eyes and you'd be like, oh, you're fine, go play. As a game designer, you want to make sure that you aren't that crying kid, that when you design your systems, that your player is first in your mind. Okay, so playing it wrong doesn't make sense. Your player is going to play your game in the way that they want to play it. You as a game developer, your role is to provide some structure and to provide rules and objectives, but you really can't be the one to say, they're playing with it wrong. During development, there were a lot of times in which I would be experimenting with a feature, and I would ask myself, if I wanted to pull back on the design a little bit, I'd say, is this something that a cool developer would do? And that would be pretty informative, because I'd be like, if no, I'm not going to do that. You can always, you want the player to feel like they've been recognized for something that they've discovered in the game. If it's a fun combination or if it's a fun technique that they've mastered, you don't want to pull back on it and say, well, actually, I don't want to give you, the full, I don't want you to have that much fun. It seems strange, but, when you're designing these systems, you're trying to balance this multivariate problem, and you want to say, how should the game be played? So My focus for Rogue Ascent was to empower the player and just make the player feel like that they're this unstoppable, you know, that they feel powerful. You know, when you take off the headset, you should have had more fun and you feel better than when you put the headset on. Rogue Ascent, I always say, is explicitly a video game. Again, this sounds very funny to say, but as a game designer, sometimes we want to couch our game in maybe bits of mysticism or act, you know, like it's not explicitly a video game. I found in the past that it's best just to, you know, admit that it's a video game and address it as such. So, you know, Rogue Ascent's gameplay is very arcade. And you know, it doesn't make any attempts to try to hide the fact that it's a video game. You know, you're trying to engage with it and have fun with it. Composite simplicity is a term that I would say refers to, in a game, you want every system to be as simple as possible. When you're teaching the system, that makes it easier to teach. And then when you are layering these systems on top of each other, it makes it a lot easier to develop complexity through a composite of more simple layers underneath. So you don't want to make a game simply complex for the sake of being complex. You want complexity to be a destination that you arrive at through iteration. Rogue Ascent has a lot of that because roguelikes, one of their kind of key features is that you have these perk systems in which every little perk just changes the game's rules just by a little bit, and each of these perks on their own, you know, aren't exactly, you know, game changing. But what happens is you get the interaction between these little modifications of the game's rule set, and after a while you get something that is unique to your playthrough. And that's one of the things that's really compelling about roguelikes, in my opinion, is that you have this procedurally generated challenge for you, and then also you kind of decide how you progress through that challenge. I wish I had 2 more hours to talk about juice. Juice is one of the coolest concepts in game design. If you're familiar with this, juice is all of the tiny little feedback, interactions, camera shake, particles, everything that makes a game feel really good to play. There's a really good talk that I'm going to link at the end of the presentation where it shows you exactly what a game feels like without juice and what it's like to have a game when you add in this juice concept. So Rogue Ascent and everything before this, I have always tried to implement juice the best to my ability, because it just adds a little bit of oomph to the game that you wouldn't get without it. So as far as what comes next, future projects, definitely more virtual reality. I just like virtual reality. I think it's fun. You know, there are new headsets coming out. It would be really nice to, for example, put Rogue Ascent on the new Apple Vision Pro. So, but I'm not opposed to diverging from hand tracking technology. You know, it's very interesting to work with new technologies, and as those come along, I'm interested in seeing, you know, what can be done with new technologies. More recently, I've been experimenting with online multiplayer projects. I think moving forward, it could be a combination of something VR and multiplayer, taking things that I've learned from Rogue Ascent, or just doing something complete and totally new from that. So if you want to see more about Rogue Ascent, you can always go to rogueascent.com. That's the best place to kind of see all the socials. If you want to reach out on Discord, I'm on Discord, bear46077. I don't know how the username system is changing. I've got an email that I need to change that, so hopefully that's still the same. And on Twitter and TikTok at RogueVR. I'll try to make all of this slides available to you guys, and if you want to reach out for any of this information, of course, you know how to contact me. Special thanks certainly to George Takahashi again for letting me give this talk and kind of telling you guys what this development cycle has been like. Of course, thank you, Blake, for hosting our events and being here to support through this. Noah Bannister and Samuel Rosser were both very instrumental in development of both Rogue Ascent and events prior. Of course, thanks to Purdue for having me, and to the rest of the Rouge Ascent team, Olivia Sabatka and Edward Ray, who did the soundtrack for the game. I speak about this project and my designs for it, but there's really a lot of people that put a lot of effort into making this project come to life. And so it's been rewarding in a lot of different ways to have that collaboration with such a large team of people who felt the same way about your inspiration. And thank you to Click Games, who is the publishing team, who has made so many opportunities available to me, and Brandon and Waylon have done really great work. I suggest, even again, if you're not doing hand tracking, the Oculus developer resources have a lot of really cool visuals, and they talk about a lot of these concepts that I brought up here. It's just so cool to go through this and see that Meta has addressed and thought about these pitfalls of designing with new technology. Okay, so highly recommend this. I mentioned juice, the concept. There's a talk that I highly recommend called Juice It or Loose It, and that was given several years back, but it has a really good demonstration of what is meant by game developers when we refer to juice in a game. So that's it for me. I'll open up the floor to any questions or anything else you'd like me to go back and readdress.
For everybody who has questions, please raise your hand and we can pass you the microphone. And for anybody else online, if you do have questions, your mics are now open. You just have to unmute, or you can type out in chat and I can relay your questions as well.
Clayton.
Is this thing on? Yeah, I guess it is. I was just curious about the multiplayer games and like how that would compare to Rogue Ascent, because if you have many people, would you be vying for those tiles that you have right there, or are you trying to make it more freeform where you can like walk and take up space?
Yeah. So the question being, how would you adapt the concept of Rogue Ascent into a multiplayer game? I've thought about several ways. I think probably my initial intuition here would be to make something that's more freeform. Rogue Ascent's movement system works really well kind of in a single player environment. All the enemies in the game utilize the same movement system that you use, so it's kind of make it on the same playing field. If you were to have a lot of people in the same space, it wouldn't really work so well. So I think probably something where you have a more free-form movement system. Something that I've been thinking about in Rogue Ascent, this node-based movement system. As I said, it's always equidistant, and it's always 5 meters away. The thing that's really nice about that is if you reach your hand out over a movement node and it takes you there, because everything is equidistant, your hand is already over the next movement node if you want to move there. So that affords some really easy movement gestures. But you could imagine, having effectively like a 10 meter in diameter hula hoop around your waist. Kind of a horizon where if you put your hand anywhere on that horizon, it would move you in that direction. So you could do a little bit more freeform. And I think for something that's multiplayer, you'd probably want something more like that.
What was it like working? I think I talked to Noah earlier, and he talked about how he had worked directly with Meta with his project. I'm assuming you had to do the same thing.
Yeah.
What was it like? What were some surprises and interesting things?
It was, it felt very redeeming because, for one, when I started this project, I had no clue whether or not, this would, I didn't know, if I was going to finish the project. There were times at which, I would wake up at 5 a.m. and be like, what am I doing? And I was like, am I wasting my time here? But there was a conversation that we had with Meta, and they said, this is the best use of our hand tracking that we've seen. And it was like an enormous weight had come off because I was like, okay, I'm doing this right. It's hard when you don't have a lot of designs to evaluate and to look after. So it was in a lot of ways very rewarding. But then also, you had the consideration of that you're not just designing the game for yourself. There's also an expectation to design for the platform, and kind of meet their expectations as well. But for the most part, I felt like I had a lot of creative liberty on the project. Everything, was very much the way that I wanted to design it.
And if I can ask a brief second question, I don't want to hog this too much, but did you ever get to actually interface directly with the hand tracking team?
I did not. I know that they had made the Reality Labs was a resource that they made available to us, and so they said, if you want to speak with anybody specifically on the hand tracking team, if you have any suggestions for them, we can put you in contact with them. But it was not a resource that I actually used.
So you were talking about kind of a little bit of the thought process of how you have to come up with different gestures and stuff like that. But so when you're looking at other VR games, especially ones with free movement, they'll often have options for snap turning, which you do have in Rogue Ascent with like the thumb gesture. So snap turning is one of the things that, at least in my head, is like would be the last thing that I think of. So if you could just walk through a little bit of the thought process of how you were like, oh, snap turning, it should be thumbs instead of anything else.
Right. Snap turning. So the question being, how did you come to arrive at the snap turn gesture, and why that as opposed to anything else? Snap turning was something that was not in the game originally. But when you're developing this, you have a community that is providing suggestions, and this was definitely one of the things that people had suggested. Accessibility is a pretty big thing, particularly with hand tracking. So people had said, I'm not super mobile, or I'm playing the game when I'm sitting down. Is there a way that we can do snap turning? Because a lot of controller-based VR games do have that as either a setting or just built in. So later on in development, I had used a lot of gestures, and I actually credit Noah Bannister for that design, because as he decided, that one of the easier things to do would be to use kind of two. We weren't really using like thumbs up gestures, and it's kind of almost like using a steering wheel, and so snap turning was a feature that had been requested for a while, and I didn't really have any great solution to that, and but as a result of it being one of the later features, that left us with the consideration of, again, we don't want to overlap gestures. You want to avoid accidentally sending input and doing a snap turn when you didn't mean to. So it had to be something that was intentional, and doing two hands with it, you might accidentally do kind of a sideways thumbs up gesture, and if it was just that, you might trigger it accidentally. But two hands, that's kind of far enough away in the design space that you don't accidentally trigger that. And so that was a lot of the design thought for that.
Do you have any advice or I don't know, just interesting experiences in starting out as an independent developer?
Oh yeah, I mean that could be another talk in itself. I will say this, nobody is going to put in as much effort as you will. So there is certainly the thought process that I enjoy working on teams, but I tend to get a lot of work done by myself. And that's because it makes you very agile. You can turn on a dime. And it's safe to say, you've got most of the design up here, and you don't have to communicate that with other people. So being independent in that sense, or even just a really small team, you can move really quickly. And I think that facilitates a lot of, experimentation. That's why you kind of see that sort of, you see smaller teams making more of the risky design strategies.
how geographically widespread was your team?
Okay, so the question was how geographically widespread was the team? We had our artist was in California. The sound designer Edward Ray was in Holland. So we were really all over the world. Most of us were in Indiana. Click Games is up in Fort Wayne, and so we were all pretty centralized time zone stuff. But that did make it so that if we wanted to get a good team meeting, we had to do it kind of at a specific point in the day.
So I know you have B-Haptics involved in the suit. Is there any other kind of experimental features or emerging VR tech that you think would be additionally immersive for Rogue Ascent, or just kind of concepts that interest you that you might not even put into Rogue Ascent?
Yeah. So the question being, what other emerging technologies have I considered for Rogue Ascent? Augmented reality being the one that comes to mind. Augmented reality is kind of a cool. In the mixed reality spectrum, you have virtual reality on one side, augmented reality, and where you stand, but in that spectrum determines a lot of your design choices. So I had specifically built Rogue Ascent for VR, but there's a lot of the gameplay mechanics and everything that would transfer really well over to augmented reality. So that's like one of them. Just recently, Meta announced that they now have multimodal controller input. So it used to be that you were either using your hands or you were using controllers, and now they have it so you can do one hand and one controller. So the example that they give is like a ping pong. They're playing like game ping pong, so you're holding actually your controller for the paddle, and your other hand is free to pick up the ball and throw it or whatever and stuff like that. So just recently they've come out with a lot of like cool things that I think would be really interesting to experiment with. Yeah, okay, so Noah writes that the thumbs up came naturally from the question, how do you gesture something over your shoulder? It was expanded to two hands to prevent accidental triggering, as there is a slight overlap with the finger gun posture. And a question comes and says, what did you feel was the largest design decision that you wanted to make but eventually had to scrap? And what led you to make that decision, if applicable? Originally in the game, you were going to, there was a lot of iteration that the game went through. So originally you were going to be in this like kind of office building, kind of retro 80s office building in a sci-fi kind of universe. And you'd get to the top floor and then you'd suit up in a giant mech suit and you would like fight on the helipad on the top of the building. But I kind of moved more towards being like you're in this big space station and you're going up floors of a space station. At that point, you're not going onto the helipad of the space station. So as a result, you go to the bridge, and that's where you do a space battle where you control the cannons of this spaceship and you're having like a space battle, which is very cool because for the most part, the game is internal, corridor shooters, and then you get to this final battle and you're using your hands to control these huge cannons and firing lasers at spaceships and they're firing back, and it's very much like Star Trek Bridge Crew where you take damage and you have to go through and repair the systems by tapping certain buttons, and also inspired by the Millennium Falcon ride at Disney. If you've ever done that one, it has a very similar, very fun sort of experience. So I'd say that was probably one of the largest design decisions that I scrapped, was just kind of how to end the gameplay experience. But I'm really satisfied with what I did design for it, because I had put a lot of thought and consideration into how are you gonna, what is the finale for the game going to be like, and at that point you've kind of already proven your worth in the game. So this final battle is just meant to be fun. So it's just meant to use all the systems that you've been learning up to this point and just kind of have fun with it.
That was a really good question. So I guess kind of an opposite question. Um, is there any design choice that made it into the final game that now looking back on it, you wish you had done differently from the beginning? So like an unfortunate consequence of early development that kind of persisted all the way through.
Yeah. Oh, so you know what? I will say that one of the most challenging things to work with was the level generation system. I tended to run into issues with the level generation itself. That required a lot of optimization. And it's kind of thing where when you start development on a project, you have this level of expertise in the things that you're building, and then by the end of the project, you have this much. And wouldn't it be nice if you'd go back to the start of the project with that much? But you don't want to redesign. You don't want to rewrite everything. So there's always that consideration of that. As you work with the system, you gain more expertise with it, and then you look back and you say, oh, I wouldn't have done it that way, or I would have refactored this in this way. And maybe the system that I would look back and be like, that was more difficult to work with than it had to have been, probably would have been the level generation, just because there's so many ways in which you can procedurally generate a level. And on one hand, it has to be an interesting shooter arena, but then also has to kind of make sense from a layout perspective. So balancing all those things, I eventually kind of came to a destination that I thought was a happy medium between all of my objectives. But looking back at that, I could say that's probably one of the ones that gave me the most trouble. What sci-fi / mainstream media inspirations did you take from? Definitely Star Trek. When you start the game, you're in this turbo lift. And I don't even couch the language. You're in a turbo lift. You walk out the hallway, and then you go into a holodeck. So it's very, very sci-fi, Star Trek oriented. I was watching, when I started development on Rouge Ascent, I was watching a lot of Star Trek Next Generation. So, my development kind of, when I started, I asked myself, I thought, what would it be like to go on an away mission with, the crew of the Enterprise? And that was kind of how I got started with it. And, there was some specific episode I remember watching and thinking, what would it be like to go on some derelict spaceship or something, or go on behind enemy lines, with any of these, characters in this cast? And what would it be like if you went with the chief medical officer, or if you were, Commander Riker? So it was really interesting to think about what that away mission would be like, depending on who you selected. And so in the game, everybody is very much. I take a lot of inspiration definitely from Star Trek, but you see a lot of visual inspiration from like Tron. A lot of 80s kind of synthwave inspiration. The music is definitely very 80s inspired. A lot of like electric guitar and synths and things like that. And then also, of course, Star Wars having its inspiration in there, either through the Disney ride, and that all of that. Star Wars land in Disney is very cool inspiration, because the Disney Imagineers have put so much effort into making this believable environment, and you get to experience it in a very unique way, particularly through those the ride experiences. So I would say, who is better, Kirk or Picard? Oh, maybe Picard. I think I'm on Team Picard, although. Commander Sisko, I've recently been watching Deep Space Nine. Maybe Sisko is just one step above. So, but no spoilers.
Got another question underneath Waylon's first one there.
How difficult is it to maintain on a standalone headset versus tethered VR? What sacrifices did you feel you had to make that you wish you didn't? Oh, okay. So this talks about what were the optimizations. Okay. So when you're playing a VR game, you're either connected to your gaming PC, and you can render your VR environment at the full fidelity of a gaming PC. But when you have something like an Oculus Quest, you're using an Android smartphone. I mean, it really is. It is an Android operating system. You build for it just as if you were making, an Android app. So as Meta has, introduced new devices, they're always going to, increase the capabilities of the devices. But when I started development with this, it was on the Quest 2 using hand tracking 1.0. So it was like, you have to be cognizant about how your stylizing of the environment has to serve both, an artistic purpose and an optimization purpose. So one of the things that Noah was really good about was he identified areas where we could make a lot of optimizations to the game. Because it's procedurally generated, you don't get a lot of the optimizations that you would be able to get with an environment that has been pre-lit and pre-baked and has been, fine-tuned by the artists. When you procedurally make something, you lose a lot of those optimizations. And the Oculus Quest, which was the target development platform, was certainly a lower graphics fidelity than like if you take even just the Vive or any, you can render beautiful, ornate, detailed environments on that. And you have to be a lot more cognizant on the Quest. I remember saying that I felt like I had, I had $1 to spend, and everything of value to me was like 25 cents, and I had you really had to figure out like what was important to you to implement into the game, because it was like you can't have everything, and so you really need to make some strategic decisions on how to optimize frame rate of the game, for example. So I'd say that the optimization of the game, I learned so much more optimizing this game than I had ever done in the past, just because it was such a tight, technical budget, you would say.
Excuse me. My second VR experience was actually this last summer at my internship, and it was focused on industry experience and training and stuff like that. So, riding in a tractor or harvesting and stuff like that, or whatever.
Yep.
And considering that you already saw a market that had potential and you jumped on it, it seemed to work out for you. I'm curious if you've thought about branching out from, having fun with video games,
Right.
or something more, perhaps, training, or
Sure.
maybe a little more immersive in the sense that it's you can take away some kind of skills development that could be applied in the real world.
Yeah, that's such a perfect question. And one of the things that I did here at the Envision Center was working on training simulations. So this was either data visualization or doing like an OSHA safety training program. And so the utility in that is that, you have these kind of gamified elements in simulation. You have a spectrum between, pure game and pure simulation, but most experiences fall somewhere between that. I'm definitely not opposed to doing, simulation as I've done in the past, or even data visualization. I think it's all really interesting challenges, and I think it all provides interesting utility. So absolutely, yeah, I think that everything you learn when you're doing game design, it's very highly it's very easy to adapt that into the simulation space or the data visualization space.
Do you think the game in mind I'm thinking about that sticks out is like either Arma or Battlefield 1?
Yeah.
And you spoke about how games should be very simple in concept, and that they shouldn't like try to say that they're any more complex than they are. Really, they're supposed to be just a game, right? But in things like that, warfare, right? They obviously have certain connotations or certain maybe even ideologies that are trying to be put onto the player, right?
Yeah.
Depending on which side you're fighting for, etc.
Right.
So, how would you get around that aspect of psychologically teaching your audience, your gamer, that
Sure.
You know,
Yeah.
like,
So,
they're
so
not- you-
the question being kind of like the kind of the ethical dilemma of being like, if you're training a simulation to, like police. Well, one of the I can kind of flip that around and say, so war fighters is one thing, but police training is very important. And so one of the projects that had been done here at the Envision Center was a police training simulation. And so you want to make sure that if an officer is going to use a firearm, that they're very accurate with their designation and that they're accurate and quick to recognize threats versus non-threats. And so, simulation exists outside of just virtual simulation. Aeronautics industry has been putting people in wooden boxes with rudders in front of them to teach them how to fly planes. Way before we were doing anything digital with it. So it's like, as far as the contents of the simulation, right? There is always that ethical concern. As I was mentioning with the police training simulator, this same sort of training simulation can be done in real life. Using blank rounds, or it can be done in virtual reality. And oftentimes the incentive for doing it in VR is that it's cost saving because you can rerun the simulation as many times. There's certainly a safety element to it. You're safe in VR. This isn't Ready Player One or anything. But then at the same time, also, it's highly configurable. So you can maintain your level of realism in the simulation while also still having it highly configurable to different scenarios. You had mentioned like Arma and these other games, and I recall that one of the games that I did enjoy playing was America's Army, which was, for all intents and purposes, just a recruitment tool. But it was a free shooter online, and I found it a lot of fun to play. I had heard the statistics was that game alone was more effective in recruitment than I think any of their other strategies like combined. It was like astronomical. So virtual reality definitely affords and lends itself very well towards simulation and training. And as far as the content of the training and simulation, that is certainly to the discretion of the developer. And if I felt like I wasn't comfortable with something, I would object to it, or I would modify, how I would design the experience. Yeah. What are you working on now? I had mentioned, so I've been doing some multiplayer testing with a kind of like a multiplayer shooter that's just kind of to get my bearings with some of the multiplayer tech. I would like to do something multiplayer after this. I think it's a lot of fun to develop community around multiplayer games. I know that a lot of the games, certainly that I showed, I think most all of them had some sort of online multiplayer networking capabilities. And so it's one thing to develop a community around a fun game in a single player setting, but it's a lot easier to develop a community around a game when you have that multiplayer interaction. And that's something that I've been kind of looking forward to doing. I've done multiplayer games in the past on much smaller scales. But this is something where I'd like to really take everything that I've learned and build something new out of that. Okay.
Take one last question.
So this one's less serious than the other ones. If you had to pick one of the following two, I guess, ideas or innovations in VR, one being proper hand haptics and the other one being proper like walking haptics, the ability to feel as though you're properly moving around in virtual space. Which one would you choose if you could pick one to be real today?
Yeah. Pun intended, hands down, it would definitely be walking. Locomotion in VR is probably one of the biggest barriers to entry for people. It's very easy to, put your hands on a keyboard and navigate a virtual environment on a PC game. But when you get into VR, a good tracking space will do you good. But when you really want to locomote, great distances, you have to have some solution for that. In a lot of games, that's kind of teleportation, or it's a smooth movement. but these have the downside of, a lot of people will feel motion sick. Even as a VR developer myself, I tend not to enjoy smooth motion in VR. It just makes me nauseous, and that's the whole, inner ear problem. And so I think having a really good system for locomotion would be inviting. It's difficult because then you're adding on more devices, like we have. You've seen the Omni treadmills and things. These are fun, but what you really want is something that has just as much fidelity and tracking of your feet, and the capability to keep you in place. I don't. You've probably seen kind of some of the more recent. I think it was Disney that had developed a floor plan that would keep you in place as you're walking. And I really hope that has some promising, progress of that, because I think that would take us really far. Because right now VR is limited in that sense, is that you have a local space in which you're tracked in your play space, but after that, you have to have some solution for locomotion. And so I would definitely take a very good locomotion solution over hand tracking haptics. I had mentioned that with B Haptics, I implemented their hand tracking gloves, and that was a lot of fun because I've mentioned that you lose out on that haptics, but adding it in with something like the B Haptics vest was a lot of fun. I'd been doing development for so long with the game, and then once I implemented B Haptics, it was like the first time I'd played the game again, and it was truly a remarkable experience to be able to play. With haptics, and you wouldn't think that it would have that much of an impact, but it really does. So even that in consideration, I'd say a good locomotion solution would be my bet.